All right, so I'm here with my friend Dave Stanley. You may have heard of Dave. He has the Murata Belt Model Railroad out in Murata, California, which you'll see here on the channel next weekend if you're watching for layout tours. You may have also seen it in RMC. It's been in RMC as well as some other magazines, right?
Yes.
So Dave's actually been a railroader, he's retired now, but has been a railroader for 40 some odd years. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and talk about the book that he co-authored here about the Central California Traction. So we're going to talk a little bit about Dave's career, about the book, stuff like that. And let's just jump right into this. So if you could, Dave. Thanks for coming, by the way.
Thank you for having me, John.
That's the first thing.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the progression of railroading jobs that you worked and kind of how it all started?
Well, it started in 1974. I went from a job with Sears Roebuck in the credit department to student brakeman on Central California Traction. I was fortunate enough to call in sick at Sears the same day that the CCT was calling me to come take a physical. And if I had not called in sick, I don't know if I would have ever had that phone call.
That's funny. You were sick going to a physical.
Well, I was sick.
Oh, it was one of those. I get it.
So forgive me, everybody at Sears. Anyway, I took the physical, and in June 26, 1974, I became a brakeman on Central California Traction. And I worked for the CCT, which was kind of my neighborhood railroad. I grew up in Sacramento, and we lived about 150 feet from CCT's old main line into downtown Sacramento. So the highlight of the day for me as a kid was about 11 o'clock at night when the train had come by. Always wanted to go to work there, and I applied, of course, and then I got that phone call. So I worked for the traction company from June of 74 until I was furloughed in November of 1978. I didn't quit at that point, but I was furloughed, and a friend of mine that worked for Western Pacific said that they were hiring, and I should go talk to the train master at Stockton Yard. So I did that, and as soon as you tell them you have any railroad experience, and if they need brakemen, they'll pick you right up on the spot, which is what happened. So I worked for the WP. I was furloughed there about 2 months later when business slowed down, and CCT was calling me back to work at the same time. So I was double heading between these two railroads for about 4 months. And then in April of 79, I left the traction company for good, went back to the WP. In the middle of all that, 1977, for 2 months, I was again furloughed at CCT, and I went to Klamath Falls, Oregon, and worked for 2 months as a brakeman on the Oregon, California, and Eastern Railway, which was Weyerhaeuser's logging and lumber railroad out of Klamath Falls.
Uh-huh.
So that was a very memorable 2-month period of my railroad career. And then, of course, Union Pacific took over the WP in 1982. The recession was going strong at that point, so nobody was working. I had to work outside of the railroad industry for 2 years. In May of 1983, Union Pacific was calling brakemen that had been furloughed to see if we wanted to work in maintenance of way on a temporary basis till business picked back up. So I worked for 5 months on a rail gang in the Feather River Canyon, pounding spikes, pulling out old spikes and ties, and just a lot of fun stuff.
So that coincided with when UP took over the WP then?
Yeah, WP would not have offered that to the furloughed trainmen, but UP did. So we quite a few of us jumped on it. We weren't the best gandy dancers out there, but I did learn how to swing a spike maul, so that was half the battle. And then in the summer of 1983, UP was raising the roadbed along the south end of Salt Lake, and they needed trainmen out there for the work trains. So a bunch of us packed up and drove out to Salt Lake, and I got to work the east end of the old WP at that point, now Union Pacific, on work trains for several months. And then a friend of mine at Stockton called and said, "Hey, we need yard masters. Come on back and we'll train you to be a yard master." So I went up to Stockton Tower and I worked as a yard master from October of 1983 until May of 1988, at which point word was out that they were going to start a series of locomotive engineer classes, and I had to basically re-exercise my seniority as a brakeman in order to get picked up for the engineer class. So November of 1988, I got picked up as an engineer, went into training for about I guess it was about an 8 or 9 month training course. And that's where I stayed until I retired in 2015 on Halloween night. So of course after 1996, the UP and the SP merged, and from that point on I probably worked more SP jobs and SP routes than I did WP.
What was your main gig, though?
I worked the extra board a lot, and then if I could hold the Dunsmuir pool, I liked running the Dunsmuir or going down to Bakersfield from Roseville. And then my last year on the railroad, I bid in a local out of Stockton that ran over the SP from Stockton to Livingston and back. So I had a daylight job, weekends off, and after 41 years, I finally got a good run. So that's how the railroad works.
I was going to say, that's how it works.
That's how it works.
Talk about paying your dues, right?
Yeah. You don't have to answer the phone at that point, so it makes it kind of nice.
So it sounds like from the beginning, as a kid, you said that the highlight in your childhood was living next to the CCT track. So it sounds like you kind of wanted to be a railroader from the start. Did you know what it meant and what the hours were like and that kind of thing? Or was it just, oh, it's trains?
Oh, it's trains. I had no clue. I had no clue that life as I knew it would end, at least for 41 years. But no, it was something I wanted to do. And of course, I had a Lionel set at first as a kid. And then I think I was about 8 or 9. My dad and his friend built an HO 4x8 layout for me and surprised me with that at I think it was Christmas. So yeah, I've always been into model railroading, and then of course, like everybody else, you go through your teen years and working for the railroad, and then finding out about girls and all that. You put all your train stuff away for a decade or a decade and a half.
Girls and cars, I think.
And cars, yes.
Yeah. For me, it was music.
Music.
Yeah. So I'm curious about this because you've written this amazing book. I mean, I looked through this book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet because it's so thick. It's something like 400 pages or damn near close to 400 pages. It's got hundreds of photos. I think it said 600 photos or something like that. More than 20 maps in the thing. It was originally pressed, in 2002, and then repressed in 2005, was it?
Yeah, 2002, the first printing came out. Signature Press was the printer. 2002, it was printed, the first copies in Hong Kong, in China. And then in 2005, the second printing was done here at Visalia, California, Jostens. And the Jostens version, which is what you see here, is superior to
I think
the original.
Jostens did my high school yearbooks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
That name rings a bell.
And they do good work.
Yeah.
All the colors are richer, the black and whites are fuller. It's just a well done. And then we had a few corrections to make between the two editions as well. So.
One question comes to mind, especially when you see how thick and how substantial this book is. What made you decide to write a book? Because it's a tremendous amount of work, right? I mean, what made you decide you wanted to write a book about the CCT?
Well, of course, growing up along the track, I had very keen interest in that particular railroad. And the books I had in my collection at the time, all the other railroads that I was interested in were covered. SP, WP, Santa Fe, Sacramento Northern, nothing on Central California traction. And it was like God himself says, Dave, you need to write this book. So what happened in 1982, I think it was, 81, because my daughter was just about born at that point. I went to visit Wilbur Whitaker in Mill Valley. I'm sure many people know and remember Will.
Sure, also known as Will.
Yeah.
Even I know that.
And he's got photographs in about every railroad book out there. And Will brought out his files of Central California traction prints, and I thought this guy can do his own book, a pictorial anyway, with what he had. So I bought quite a few prints from him and took took them home and started mulling over the ideas and started finding out what information was available out there through historical societies. I was fortunate enough, having worked for CCT, even though I wasn't there anymore in the early 80s, that the management there I was good friends with, and they gave me access to all their back office files, which included authorizations for expenditures going back to like 1910. It was all there. What was missing was from 1905 to 1910. Everything else we had at our fingertips. I'd been working on it for a couple of years, and Jeff Moreau and I were old friends. Jeff's passed away, but I have a lot of good memories of Jeff. And he says, Dave, he says, how would you like a little help on that book as far as the research and whatnot? And Jeff had a very good background in electric railroading. He worked for the Pacific Electric, he worked for SF Muni, and he had a definite better understanding of electric railways than this diesel-oriented kid did. So Jeff came on board. We did some early research for those early years, 1905 to 1910, thereabouts, and making countless trips to Stockton and Lodi libraries, going through microfilm, and we went through historical societies, San Joaquin County, Sacramento County, really every outlet that was available to us to find information out about CCT's corporate history, and of course the history of all of its equipment. And Jeff had a very substantial photographic collection himself that he was willing to share for this project. So we collaborated on this and ended up with 410 pages, 626 photographs. There's 22 maps and drawings of equipment in the back of the book, full rosters, and a bibliography. And like I say, it was published first in 2002 and reprinted in 2005. We lost Jeff, I want to say about 2014, I think somewhere in there, he passed away. But, without Jeff's help, the book would not be anything like it is here. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at it, if no one has done a book on the CCT, it looks like no one needs to. I mean, that's how substantial this thing. I mean, this is it's like a textbook, and it's heavy like a textbook, and there's just everything you could possibly want to know seems to be in here already. So it's very well put together.
Our feeling was, let's get one book done and do it right. And if anybody wants to do a follow-up edition from 2003 on up till 2015 or beyond, then more power to them.
Yeah, because CCT is still
still
running.
115 years now, I guess. Yeah.
Now, something that I remember hearing about, and I haven't had a chance, like I said before, I haven't had a chance to read the book just because of how thick it is and how busy I am, but didn't some other companies have something to do with it? Like it was a collaboration between SP and Santa Fe or something like that? What was that part of it?
Briefly, CCT's history, 1905, Howard Griffiths, H.H. Griffiths, as he was known, was the brainchild behind getting it started. And it was originally conceived as a second streetcar railway for the city of Stockton to compete with Southern Pacific's Stockton Electric. And by 1907, Griffiths had come to the point where he realized that he needed to expand this service. There was no money being made in Stockton. So they expanded service to Lodi. And at about that time, of course, the Fleischacker brothers got involved from San Francisco, Mortimer and Herbert Fleischacker. And Griffiths, in the meantime, was getting ill. He had cancer and was falling out of the picture. And the Fleischackers, by 1910, were majority owners of the railroad. Also that same year, the railroad was expanded to Sacramento, which was basically the zenith of its plans. They had talked about going to Modesto, which of course the Tidewater Southern later on did. And then there were other expansion plans, but nothing ever materialized. But they did have a 52-mile route from Stockton to Sacramento. And part of that is still being operated today from Stockton to Lodi. The Fleischackers owned the railroad until 1928, at which point Herbert Fleischacker sold it to Southern Pacific, And the WP and the Santa Fe both said, wait a minute, there's a monopoly going on here. And they went to the Interstate Commerce Commission and said, we want equal shares at this railroad. So after, I don't know, a year or so of deliberating, the ICC came back and split the railroad up equally 3 ways.
Okay, that's what I thought I remembered hearing
And then
about.
today, because of all the mergers, it's now owned 2/3 by Union Pacific and 1/3 by BNSF.
Oh, interesting. So that continues even now.
That continues, and that's why it still runs as an independent company.
Right? So here's the thing. Now, also, if I remember right, doesn't CCT also do most of the switching in the port of Stockton? Or is that something that...
All of the switching in the port.
Oh, so it's all of the switching. I thought, for some reason, I thought Stockton Terminal and Eastern did some of that too.
No,
but
they're
I guess-
over on the east side of Stockton.
Okay.
They handle industrial work on the east side. So the CCT handles the port of Stockton. They handle Rough and Ready Island, which is adjacent to the port. And then they still run the original main line from Stockton to Lodi. So they have about a 15-mile stretch of the original track that they still use. And over the years, the traffic base, which used to be originally was a farmer's railroad originally, a lot of agriculture, and then milk as well. Was picked up in express cars. And then over the years, that changed to canned goods and wine, lumber, and that has evolved now to today's California traction, at least in the Lodi area, where you have canned goods, you have plastics, and you have liquid sugar. No more wine is shipped out of Lodi on the rail. A lot of it's trucked out or piggybacked out.
Sure, because there's a lot of wine
There's
in
a
that
lot
area.
of wine there. Yeah.
Sure.
Unfortunately, none of it goes out in boxcar.
So there's one thing that I want to mention, and this is kind of an aside. We did your layout tour of your model railroad here a couple months ago. As time goes, like I said before, it'll be out next week here on the channel. And you told me when we were doing the layout tour, if I remember right, that you designed the red paint scheme that's on the CCT Jeeps. And I had a model of one, and I did it before I even met you. I did a product spotlight on this model from Atlas, and I was talking about how much I liked that paint scheme. I'm just curious if you wouldn't mind sharing it with the audience. How did it come to be that you were the one who ended up designing that paint scheme?
Well, Ken Tinker was the general manager of CCT in the 70s. In fact, he's the guy that hired me. And we had a really good relationship. Ken actually helped me quite a bit with the book.
Okay.
Some of the later chapters. But at the time, he was, when he first took over, CCT was being operating with secondhand Alco locomotives that were pretty much on their last legs, and a couple of leased SP engines. Ken knew I was into model trains and kind of a railroad historian. I don't like to use the word rail fan, but anyhow. Ken said, we're getting a couple of GP7s from Chrome Crankshaft, which was a used locomotive dealer. These were former Reading Railroad GP7s running long head forward. And he says, I think you can come up with a paint scheme for me. He says, I want to stay with red and white. And he says, I'm going to put the quatrefoil emblem on the engine. And by the way, he was the gentleman that resurrected that emblem, which hadn't been used since the early 30s when the traction company was getting out of their passenger business. So I did paint some models at home. I took a couple different versions, and I came up with basically the version that you see here on this Atlas model. And he liked it. And I had no decals for the quatrefoil, so I took one of his business cards and cut out the CCT logo and glued it onto the side of the engine. But it worked. And he says, that's the way we'll do them. And they came one day, they were delivered, and they were gorgeous. They were painted in DuPont Imron red, and they looked like they'd been waxed 100 times. And I was real proud of that moment.
I mentioned it on the product spotlight that I did of this locomotive, that it's one of the sharpest looking paint schemes that I've come across. So I think you did a good job. If you don't mind me telling, all right, yeah. If you don't mind me telling you so. And one of the things I was joking with earlier off camera was that it was before I had met you, so you knew I wasn't trying to blow smoke on purpose. I actually liked the paint scheme. So back to the book. It seems like the definitive work on the subject. How do people get this book?
Well, here's the story. I'll capsulize it. Signature Press is taking it off the market after, 15 years? But they gave me the chance to buy as many copies as I wanted to. So I picked up quite a few copies, and I have them available basically at wholesale cost of $40 and $6 for shipping. So $46, you can get them directly through me, and my email would be rrfreak, that's rrfreek @gmail.com, and I accept PayPal, or if you want to send a check, you can email me and I'll give you a mailing address.
Okay, that works. Now, I don't recall, what was the retail on these things?
Yeah, these retailed at $65.
That's what I thought. I knew it was
Yeah.
around 60 or 70 bucks.
And there's still some available in some of the bookstores and hobby shops at that price. So,
Well, like I said before, this is a very thick, very substantial book. Lots of pictures. That's the part I like. I read books for the pictures, you know.
who doesn't?
That's my thing, yeah. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk.
Thank you, John, for having us.
Yeah, great having you over. And eventually I'll read the book, and then I'll be calling you back to tell you how great it is.
Well, I hope I'm still alive.
By the time I read it, you might not be. By the time I end up reading it, I might not be. So, Dave Stanley, everybody. And now back to me in the studio.